To further break down these unalienable rights, let's take one at a time. Life, meaning no one can take your life lawfully. It is yours to do with as you wish. And in order for for this right of life to be taken from you, you must actively be threatening someone else's life and get killed doing it, or answering to charges for committing heinous act or treason. Liberty, this is the right to freely move about and make choices, and above all, the right to own, sell, and create an intellectual or material property. Since your property is a manifestation of the finite time we all have living and working on this good earth, our right to property is a very sacred one. It allows you to also sell property for an agreed upon sum in order to accumulate more and more different kinds of property, thereby increasing wealth and exchanging it for currency that everyone uses, and saving it or giving it to select charities. Some good examples are owning a house, a car, food, insurance, stocks, lamps, bonds, clothes, money, patents for inventions, copyrights, etc. The pursuit of happiness now. The pursuit of happiness is, in those days, just meant fulfillment, not necessarily giggles and grins, but whatever floats your boat. Religion, life needs, relationship, family goals, etc. Basically, these are covered in your Bill of Rights. It just means that you are in control of your own destiny and that you govern yourself. You don't necessarily have a right to these things, but by taking care of life, liberty, and property, no government entity will stand in your way, if it's run right, of obtaining anything you desire. If a private citizen stands in your way, you have the right to have your case heard before a judge. Knowing this, it is easy to see that nothing is free, and to get free is to take it from someone else who is most likely an unwilling participant. That means that a person's unalienable rights have to be violated for you to get something the government calls free. Part of the Declaration is about the 27 indictments of our former master, King George III. One fun one was the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on all goods, papers, etc., even if you made it yourself with your own materials. If one didn't have the money for one of these stamps, the goods were seized by soldiers. And a law that made the Stamp Act especially bad were the writs of assistance and later the Townshend Acts, because they changed under different kings, which allowed soldiers to basically write their own search warrant on the spot and ransack your home looking for stamps anytime they liked, so they could collect more taxes or goods when they needed the money, or just to steal from you, whichever. Our Bill of Rights, specifically the Fourth Amendment, inspired by Thomas Otis, years before it was written, to make this illegal search and seizure, to make this illegal search illegal, as it should be. He was beaten up very badly in a bar and sustained brain injury by people he stood up to in court on this subject. He died some years later, but had difficulties the remainder of his life. He's one of our forgotten founders, and the only reason we really know about him is because John Adams happened to write about it, because he was there in the courtroom. Thank you, Mike Lee. Because of these indictments, George III, listed in the Declaration of Independence, spurred a third conversation. That keeping power away from lunatics in the first place, or easier said, preventing centralization of government, or collectivism, all the same thing, tyranny. Charles de Montesquieu, and he was read very widely during the forming of the Constitution. John Locke was read and cited a lot during the Declaration of Independence. Now we've got Charles de Montesquieu, who was very talked about during the forming of our government and the Constitution, because he's the one that came up with the idea of separation of powers. 3 equal branches: the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive. He went on about how humans are imperfect creatures and that we all eventually succumb to greed and avarice, or power and money. Lord Acton similarly said that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Montesquieu outlined that would be the idea for checks and balances system for each of the parts of government to have equal share of power, none stronger than the other. This meant divided, specific, and limited powers and responsibilities, so one branch didn't have unfair power to leverage over another person or the other branch. They all had to be in agreement. This caused slowed government, and slow government is good because slow government limits bad things from happening too quickly. So we have Articles 1, 2, and 3 of enumerated limited powers the particular branches have. The government was to be kept in the confines of those very carefully chosen powers so as not to interfere with private citizens' circle of liberty. But remember, the circle of liberty, that's what nobody's supposed to penetrate, nobody's supposed to bother you. So if there's an overstep of government, which means they're stepping into the next, like if the judiciary starts working with the executive branch too much, and they pretty much erase the lines of separation of powers, and they can take whatever they want from you. We don't want that to happen. So slowed government, intrusion from government. These government's another job is to protect commerce between the states, regulate commerce overseas, and provide protection of its citizens from outside forces. That means like wars, invaders, things like that. We're supposed to protect from that, and also close threats are your responsibility, which means that you have to have the right to protect yourself, which is the Second Amendment. That's what that's for. It's also against the government in case they get too tyrannical because they've all melded together, all three branches, and become one, and they want to come after you. So that's why that amendment is pretty important too. So everything in our Constitution has been chosen very carefully in order to prevent the rise of a dictatorship. Remember, the framers had fresh personal experiences with this and wanted to ensure that no dictatorship could spring forth easily with our Constitution. They all knew that men are equal with what they know, that all people, whether they are in government, have the same tendencies as others to get lost in money and power, and eventually out of good intentions or bad, become the tyrant that they fought against. Which means no matter who you are, if you have unrestrained power, it's going to go to your head. Of course, you're going to ask for more while you're there. That's why there's so much politics going on. They're trying to say that well, it's good for this group or that group, and they try to divide people up and pit people against each other. That's all politics. Conservatives, we don't like politics at all. We just like to be able to have the government run the way it's supposed to run, according to the rule of law, according to everything that's set out, the separation of powers, our rights, everything have to be protected. But they have little respect for that because there's always somebody that thinks they are smarter than everybody else. And that's how you get tyranny. They never intend it. A lot of them don't even intend becoming a tyrant, but they always end up leaning that way because they think that they just know more than everybody. So with natural rights, natural law, and a list of indictments, 2,500 years of knowledge passed down by philosopher after philosopher, detailing what has been proven to work and what doesn't. The framers of our Constitution, who were all very well-read men, had exactly what they needed to form the first U.S. Constitution. But that didn't happen for another 13 years. What we had first was the Articles of Confederation, written partly by Benjamin Franklin, who inserted the Federalism ingredient into it. It's something he learned from Canassatego, who was an Iroquois chief, who taught Mr. Franklin about independence and sovereignty of his 5-tribe Onondaga nation that he built at that time. We share a special union and friendship with these natives at that time. We quickly lost that. Mr. Franklin took this new approach, federalism, and applied it to the states so that each state was essentially its own country at that time, with its own particular laws and constitution, with no president, only governors. In federalism, most of the lawmaking powers rest with the states, and very few limited and specific national laws were made. See the 10th Amendment. We'll go over that later. We had a very weak and small federal government with a continental army. It was barely good enough to get us to the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. It became apparent that the Articles were in need of some adjustment, due chiefly to the lack of money for Washington's Continental Army. We built up a huge debt and tried to get the money from the states by taxation. The states had their own issues to deal with and said that their militias are all they needed. Delegates rarely showed up to Congress, and the entire thing was an inefficient mess. Our fledgling nation was just learning how to be a country, and we needed a slightly more powerful central government to make that happen. So that's how I meant in the diagram that we're a little bit more to the right with Articles of Confederation. We need a little bit more government to help protect people's rights and to help protect our nation.